Greetings, friends. Juan Ingriska here, and this is the weekly Russian-Ukraine War update for the weeks of May 12th through May 25th of 2025. And if you want to continue receiving these weekly Russian-Ukraine War updates, be sure to subscribe to my channel, give this video a thumbs up, and comment your thoughts and share this video around. Now, I apologize for the lack of video update last week, but I was on vacation, and that vacation was fun as hell. So, during these, so this week we're going to do a special 2-week update, and we have a lot of good updates happening. The Russian summer offensive is now in full swing, and specifically, I think this is where we're going to be focusing a lot for this summer, is this area between, I call this part of the Toretsk direction, but, it's basically between Toretsk and the Pokrovsk direction, but it's kind of like its own unique little flavor. But this is where one of the most interesting and biggest happenings have happened. A lot has happened, actually. So let's talk about what's happening on the more kind of western side of this area right here. So before we talk before we left last 2 weeks ago, we talked about the Russian breakthrough into Novoyelivka. We talked about how the Russians were starting to enter the village of Poltavka. They entered the most eastern outskirts of the village of Malinovka. And so, I was kind of talking about, where the Russians will go from this. And from here, they completed all their a bunch of tactical objectives here. Not only did the Russians, break through from Novoyelivka and, reach this other end of the reservoir, like I said they would, they made a massive breakthrough in the village of Poltavka and completely secured this village here. So before, the Russians were stuck on this, on the most southern outskirts of this village, but not only have the Russians captured everything along this reservoir, I thought, the Russians would kind of stop something like this once they took Novoyelivka. They would only take half of Poltavka. But it seems like there's been some sort of localized breakthrough from the highway here, and we actually have geolocated confirmation of the Russians reaching all the way up to the southern outskirts of the village of Chasov Yar and Poltavka. So all these fields. So not only did the Russians, take these fields between these two reservoirs, which I thought they would do anyway, they actually improved upon their situation and took all these fields here. So just to give you an example of how much progress has been taken this week, we're talking something like this. Everything in this area was taken by the Russians. So this is a massive breakthrough for the Russians. Poltavka has fallen. The Russians now have a very solid position on their western flank here as they approach the southern part of Konstantinovka. It does seem like the Russians are now going to try to battle for the villages of Chasov Yar and Poltavka, and probably Lyman Yar after that. The purpose of this is to just improve their positions, to start, improving, kind of shaping the battlefield for the Battle of Konstantinovka. This is what this whole thing is about. The push in this area, the push to take Chasov Yar, the push in Toretsk. All these battles are culminating for the Battle of Konstantinovka, which, according to a lot of pro-Russian sources, are what the main one of the main goals for the Russian summer offensive is. Because if you look at this, with the Russian pushes in this area where the Russians are trying to, reach, Toretsk from the south here, reach Toretsk from the north here, in terms from Chasov Yar, and then also their improvements here will allow the Russians to reach it from the west. And so they're trying to encircle it on 3 sides here, and so there'll be only one road of attack, one road of supply from Druzhkivka, which will be under complete Russian FPV, under Russian drone control, and then they'll be able to take Konstantinovka. So as you can see, the Russians are shaping this battlefield to try to take Konstantinovka. So I might once. Once Chasov Yar is taken, Toretsk is taken, and everyone pushes to Konstantinovka, this entire area could be renamed to the Chasov Yar direction. So, the Konstantinovka direction. So this entire area, these two fronts, the Toretsk and Chasov Yar directions, will merge into the Konstantinovka direction. So this is what the Russians are going to be doing. They're going to be marching into Poltavka and Chasov Yar and Lyman Yar. They'll continue also pushing to trying to clear this pocket here, obviously. So the Russians are also pushing towards the village of Shenkenko-Pershi. Reaching the outskirts of that village as well. So, the Russians might take something like this, going like this. But then, after that, maybe the Russians will push towards, these tree lines to the north here, try to cut this road that connects, that supplies Konstantinovka. They might push towards these villages of Toretsk, Shavkovka, and Volodymyrovka, just so that if they push here, then they could continue pushing westwards, and then cut the main highway that supplies Pokrovsk. So they don't have to like battle for these huge defensive lines, within in the town of Rodonensky, which has a bunch of high-rise buildings and terracons. The village of Nova Konomachi, which has this giant this like substation and this terracon. So the Russians attack just directly from here. There's a lot of strong defenses the Ukrainians have built up to thwart that. But if the Russians could exploit by breaking through in these like kind of tiny villages here, first try to take these 3 villages, right? And then maybe take these 3 villages. So at that point, then the Russians could push, to the west and try to reach, these, Novodonbassy, Belitsky, and then this would cut the main road that supplies Pokrovsk from the north, and then the only thing the Russians will have to do is then improve their positions in the western part of Pokrovsk, moving along this rail line, and then cutting these highway here. So at that point, then all roads leading to Pokrovsk would be physically cut. And so at that point, that would completely devastate the Ukrainian positions in Pokrovsk and Leningrad, which is another part for the Russian offensive here. Now, speaking of that, not only have the Russians improved their positions here, they're also improving their positions also in the more eastern part of Leningrad. So the other thing is that we have geolocated confirmation the Russians have completely captured the village of Malinovka. We have Russian positions on the most western part of this village being attacked. It looks like they're now battling for the village of Mirnia, which is a much smaller village, which I have no doubt that they'll be able to take. It's just a one-street village here. So I don't doubt the Russians will be able to take this, and Ukrainians will fall back to much more better positions on the other side of this Kerensky-Toretsk River. They have this, pretty decent-sized village, this terracon with the height dominance, and this substation factory, and so this could continue protecting the eastern flank of Leningrad, but but I do think they're going to give up Mirnia. But the biggest thing is that the Ukrainians built a bunch of trenches. Anyway, yeah, the Ukraine. If you look at the trench map, the Ukrainians have a bunch of trenches in this area right here. Like just a huge number of fortifications between Malinovka and Mirolubovka, which are preventing the Russians from fully exploiting it. So they might have to give this up if the Russians, continue, because then they could, outflank them and encircle the Ukrainians trying to defend these fields here. But besides that, the Ukrainians still have a lot of positions to defend. But they were using these villages to hold the Russians off, and it looks like they won't be able to anymore. I do think the Russians will, in extension with pushing towards Poltavka Yar and Poltavka, continue pushing a bit westward here. Probably try to take the villages of Shinjigo, Pershi, Mirnia, and Kopachivka. Try to take something like this going on, and and then from here they could expand in multiple directions. There's a lot of things the Russians could do. I could definitely see this being a if the Russians could take Poltavka, Poltavka Yar, and Rusin Yar in a relatively short period, I could definitely see them having a very big breakthrough in this area. And this will probably be the sauce that will allow the Russians not only to encircle Pokrovsk, but also in the future operations to start, encircling the next towns and cities that the Russians need to take in Donbass, namely the cities of Drustovka and Doropilia. So, pushing in this area between these two would also help liberating these 2 villages. Well, not even villages, these are 2 cities. As you can see, they're pretty big. Anyway, so yeah, the eastern part of this is improving very rapidly, but let's not forget about the Toretsk itself, which is also improving rapidly. So not only that, the Russians are, improving from Novy Leninivka, and, as I mentioned, they're continuing pushing along this reservoir towards the village of Yelonumovka. We have confirmation of the Russians taking more of these fields around Yelonumovka. I won't be surprised if the Russians start battling for this village starting this week. But, they're now, pushing along these fields, just, using the reservoirs as their own natural defense to hook on their northern flank as they push into Yelunovka, which is on the other side of the river, so it helps the Russians. But where the Russians are also making very rapid progress is trying to collapse the Zornia pocket, as I call it. And we actually got geolocated confirmation yet today, actually, of the Russians actually starting the battle for Zoria. We have geolocated confirmation of the Russians being in the center of this village. So before the only thing we had in the last week or so was that the Russians, were trying to capture these fields to the west of Zornia, but they still had, Zoria was still being held and everything. But now we have geolocated confirmation the Russians are battling for Zoria, and so this entire kind of Zoria pocket here is rapidly collapsing. We also have geolocated confirmation the Russians have completely captured the village of Romanovka here. We got the report from the Ministry of Defense, and we have geolocated confirmation of the Russians being droned here. So Romanovka has been taken. We talked about the Russians reached right on the outskirts of it last video, but now they have taken it. So as I mentioned, I talked about this last week, but once they took Alexandropol, 2 weeks ago, and then Romanovka last week. Now they basically took the two things that were holding the flanks together, and they are pushing on multiple angles. The Russians are now pushing towards from the east here, and then from the west here. From the west is where they're making the most progress. And basically, this entire pocket in Staromykolaiivka and everything is going to collapse. So I wouldn't be surprised that, by the end of maybe even this week, especially by the end of this, I would be surprised if this pocket still remains after this week. But I wouldn't be surprised if within a day or two, if the Russians completely clear Zorya and clear this entire area, and the Ukrainians fall back to much more better positions here, which is where the Ukrainians will try to hold the Russians off. They'll try to hold the Russians off in these kind of fort villages here. And, so, their flanks will now be secure, so they'll be able to hold off. But, I'm pretty much certain that this pocket is going to be liquidated by the next video. So, yeah. But, yeah, and also we have the Russians breaking into Staromykolaiivka. I think the Ukrainians are doing a slow withdrawal, as with all these slow movements, the Ukrainians aren't stupid. They see this pocket forming. They're just here to delay the Russians. But they're slowly pushing, retreating and retreating back to Alexandrov, Kalinovo, Katerinovka. So they're doing a lot of, there's going to be not many Ukrainians left in this pocket. Maybe they might leave the wounded behind or something like that, but, I don't think there's going to be a bunch of troops here. There might be a few dozen, but, I don't think they're going to capture a lot of people here. But the clearing of this will flatten the front line, and then the Russians will be able to continue developing their offensive towards, reaching this water reservoir here. So yeah, a lot of rapid progress in the Minograd, kind of the Toretsk Minograd area. So a lot, and I'm very this is probably the most exciting part of the front line so far. So it's very interesting to see what's happening. But then in Toretsk itself, since we're talking about the Toretsk direction, is the Russians are making some small progress. And this week we have GLK confirmation. The Russians have captured the village, this village of Delinovka right here. This kind of railway station right here. And we have some GLK confirmation of the Russians also being in these fields between these terracons and these water reservoirs. I do think this entire area here is like this giant gray zone. There's not a lot of covert here, but so I do think this is a bit of a gray zone here. So I think this is kind of where Ukrainians and Russians don't really fully control it. This area right here needs some clarification. This map is changing very smallly, very small gains. I do think the Russians here have more better positions than, we have so much GLK confirmation that I do think that the Russians have something like this under their control. So everything under this red line has been controlled. We also have GLK confirmation of the Russians continuously pushing along these trenches on the other side of the Seversk Donetsk canal. So they've taken these areas right here. Everything on the other side of this canal is extremely heavily fortified by the Ukrainians. So this is because the Ukrainians are also using this canal as a defense zone. But the Russians really need to take a few of these tree lines here just to support the northern flank here. I do think the Russians will probably continue pushing, trying to fully secure this kind of northern part of Toretsk here. Because then once they do that, they could then wait until Chasov Yar improves a little bit, and then try to liquidate this pocket to the east of Konstantinovka. I do think that once this Zorya pocket is liberated, the Russians will continue pushing along this reservoir here. The Russians will enter Yelubiko from here, and then the Russians will continue moving along these fields, but then they'll also move along this reservoir to try to start battling for the village of Katerinovka and Kilwin-Balka. And then if they could take these two villages, then they could actually fully much cut off Ukrainian positions in Seversk and Novospassky, and then from here they could then take everything like this. And then this is what the Russians are ultimately trying to do, trying to clear everything underneath this red pocket. But I do think they're going to try to it seems like the Ukrainian positions in Seversk and Novospassky are very secure. But I do wonder if the Russians will be able to take Kilbin-Bolka and Katerinovka. I do think there'll be the battle for these two villages will be a very bloody battle, because the Ukrainians really don't want to lose this. If they lose this, they lose their positions in Novospassky and Seversk. So the battle for these villages will be very bloody. But this is where the next push for the Russians in this kind of Toretsk direction is going to be. All right, now we're going to go to the Pokrovsk direction, and this is also where the Russians are making some small progress, but mostly in the kind of this area towards Poltavka. But in terms of Pokrovsk itself, the Russians are improving their positions rapidly in the village of Zeronia, which improves their western position here. We have GLK confirmation of the Russians taking most of the most of the village of Zornia. The only thing preventing them from completely capturing it is this kind of mini Terrakon right here, which the Russians have not captured yet. But the Russians need to capture this Terrakon, and I do think that's what the Russians will be doing. We do have GLK confirmation of the Russians, trying to take a lot of these areas to the north of Shchetenko and Peshana, which will give them a staging area to try to launch an attack to take this Terrakon. But if they could take this Terrakon, then they could completely take the village of Zhirania, and the Ukrainians will fall back towards the southern part of Pokrovsk in this, where they also have another Terrakon and a few, and obviously this high-rise building area and a few other buildings. But securing just Zhirania for the Russians will allow the Russians to continue pushing along this rail line and secure their flank a little bit towards, as they try to cut this highway and this road that supplies Pokrovsk. We also have some map updates that show that these fields to the north of Zhirania have been captured by the Russians, which makes sense. I do think the Russians will continue moving along this rail line just to use it as a natural defense line, and then try to just continue pushing into and try to cut off this area right here. So we shall see. But the push into Zhirania basically helps secure the western part of the Pokrovsk advance, but it is still slow and steady once they're raised in this type of area. But where the Russians are making most progress in the Pokrovsk direction is this area in the Dnipro Oblast. We have basically GLK confirmation the Russians have entered the Dnipro Oblast, but not in any significant way. They finally touched the border, but there's not a solid Russian position in the Dnipro Oblast. The Ukrainians are putting a lot of troops trying to prevent the Russians from entering the Dnipro Oblast. They really don't want the Russians entering it. It would be a very big PR disaster, and the Ukrainians love PR. But the biggest thing is the Russians are continuously battling for Novosibirsk, and we talked about how the Russians made a breakthrough in this area after they captured Poltavka and Nova Alexandrivka. And so this week, the Russians are now battling for the village of Nova Mykolaievka and Novosibirsk, but the Ukrainians know that if the Russians break through here or take Novosibirsk, they'll reach the Dnipro Oblast. So the Ukrainians are putting a very big stiff resistance, and I wouldn't be surprised if, say, Novosibirsk, Nova Mykolaievka, go like Uspenivka, and it takes a few months for the Russians to clear it, because the Ukrainians really don't want the Russians to reach the Dnipro Oblast here. Anyway. So yeah, the Russians are slowly but surely trying to improve their eastern flank here. This also helps them improve their ability to take Udachna, which I do think the Russians will try to take eventually, but nothing has been improved in that situation. A bit more in the more southern direction here, the Russians, we have GLK confirmation. The Russians have completely captured the village of Toretsk and Bogdanovka. We have the Russians raising their flags here, and so now the Russians are battling for the village of Goryovka here. This village is now hotly contested. It's probably going to be going as the way of Uspenivka, because if Gorovka falls, the Russians will have a very solid, kind of a good position to enter the fields of Dnipro Oblast and then enter Nova Poltavka. And so the Ukrainians are really also putting a bunch of troops here to prevent that. So, yeah, the Ukrainians really are putting up a bunch of fierce resistance to prevent the Russians from entering the Dnipro Oblast. So, yeah. And then around Bogdanovka, the Russians have improved their positions a little bit, capturing some of these fields like this. We already thought Bogdanovka fell to the Russians, but we just got GLK confirmation a few days ago. But I did think the Bogdanovka was already taken by the Russians. But they did improve their position in the southern part here a little bit, and the fields around it. So that was something. So, yeah, the Russians are right now, I think the main purpose in this area, the Russians are pushing towards Nova Poltavka, and they've kind of stopped in this area. It seems like the Russians are just waiting to improve their supply situation here. Maybe try to push the Ukrainians away from this kind of highway that supplies the Russians in this western part of Pokrovsk. But I think the Russians are right now just trying to see if the Russians could pull up their eastern flank here. Because if you look in the global scope here, obviously it's the Russians are putting pincers around Pokrovsk and Metrograd and making a lot of rapid progress here. So yeah, that's the Pokrovsk direction. Now let us go to the South Donetsk direction, and this is where a lot of interesting things are also happening as well. A lot of interesting things happening, and the biggest thing in the South Donetsk direction is that the Russians have completely captured the village of Bahatyr in Ordania. This was very, we talked about how the Russians entered Bahatyr, but I thought that, the Ukrainians would resist this very fiercely because, Bahatyr, still had supply, they still had the northern supply route open, they still had the western supply route open, and so, I thought Bahatyr would be held very fiercely, and, the Ukrainians they continue counterattacking, sending suicidal attacks to try to take Bahatyr, but to try to take it back, or at least say they're back there, but They're very much, they really didn't want to lose this because, the fall of Bahatyr was one of the main strongholds for the Ukrainians, and now, the Russians could move along this river here. Yeah, let me put it with but yeah, there's this river that goes all the way up into the Dnieper Oblast, and this could, the Russians could then use this area to, and I think there's like this other river that I think cuts something. Let me double check here. Yeah, so there's like multiple rivers that intersect here, but yeah, everything to like I think right here or something. Yeah, so everything underneath this red line, the Russians can now pretty much take. There's very little in the way of preventing the Russians, but as there's just a bunch of open fields, and that's not the best area to hide. But now that there's a bunch of greenery, the Russians do have a chance to push through here and try to take the rest of these villages here, and this would very much try, and they're going to try to pull up the flank in this area, try to pull, make the Russians here pull up towards the village of Dachna and Filia, and then, if the Russians could break through Novomykolaievka and Moravka, they could then start battling for the town of Poltavka, which I think is the main goal for the Russians in this area. And then obviously this would also allow the Russians to take one of the last Ukrainian strongholds in southern Donbass, which is Kamar. So the main goal here is Kamar and Novopoltavka, and then I think just for administrative and PR purposes, the Russians want to take the rest of southern Donbass, just because again one of the main goals is to liberate Donbass, and this is the this red line shows the administrative border. So as you can see, let's change the color here just to show what the Russians might want to do here. So the Russians will then try to push towards here. And then then there's another river where the Ukrainians could defend, but then obviously the Russians are pushing here. So if the Russians could finally break through the Shetevko defenses, then and take Kamar, then there's gonna be nothing left. The Russians could basically take the rest of the southern Donbass. So the capture of Bahatyr and Ordania, this was another place. I thought the Russian improvements in these fields have been very rapid. And I'm very excited to see where the Russians will go next. So yeah, this entire area, Bahatyr and Ordania, and these fields here have been captured by the Russians here. So very solid progress for the Russians. The Ukrainians probably retreat back to Kamar, and I do think, if I remember the trench map correctly, I need to find it. I keep forgetting where it is, but I keep seeing it thrown around. But the Ukrainians have some trenches around Kamar because obviously they want to defend this major supply point, but yeah, it's going to be very hard for the Russians. I do think the Ukrainians will try to put some sort of fight here, but Kamar is now definitely in play for the Russians to take, and it also helps that maybe the Russians will try to cross this river here and try to start battling for the village of Novoukrayinka, Zelina Kut, and Alexeyevka here, but because they need to take these villages to secure their northern flank a little bit before they continue pushing that way. So yeah, very, very solid progress for the Russians in Bahatyr and Ordania. They're also making some solid progress in this area right here near Velika Novosolovka. The biggest thing is the Russians have completely captured the village of Leopolia. We have Juliki confirmation of the Russians raising their flag, so they finally took this village. This was kind of contested for almost a month now, so I was kind of, I'm like, why have the Russians not been able to take it? But they finally have taken it, so very good gain for the Russians here. The Russians have stalled in these fields here. Once they took Vasola and Berlaska, they kind of stopped here. So, I do think the Ukrainians are putting a very strong fight for Shetevko. It's a pretty decent-sized village that the Russians could use to continue pushing northwards here towards the Vochka River. But, I do think, but the capture of Leopolia is a very good first step for the Russians. But where the Russians are making very much rapid progress, and, as in these villages of Leopolia and Novopil. So most mappers have shown that the Russians are now battling for these villages. No one has confirmed that they've been taken yet, but I wouldn't be surprised that within a day or two we do get GLK coverage of the Russians raising their flags in Leopolia and Novopil. This makes sense. Not only does this, secure their flank a little bit, but this also completely captures more villages in the in Donbass, and then they could then use these villages to to give themselves a better position to, because what I think is the main goal for the southern Donbass offensive is, what's good about this is that there's a river that divides Donbass from the Dnieper Oblast, so the Russians could use that as a natural defense point. And so, what I think the Russians are going to try to do is take Novopoltavka, and then, push to this river here, and then take something like this, So, then this will allow them to take the rest of southern Donbass. And from here, I think the Russians will pause because I don't think this is the main. I think the main push is going to be in Pokrovsk and Konstantinovka, but I do think this, pushing in South Donetsk for the summer will, tie down Ukrainian forces, and then in the future, I do think the Russians will then use their positions here to start trying to outflank Gallipoli and just move to the west here. Alrighty, now we're going to go to the Chasov Yar direction, and this week we only have a little bit of a few updates here. There's been a lot of chatter that the center part of Chasov Yar has fallen. I still have no idea why it has not fallen, despite being surrounded on three sides for almost I think for almost most of 2025 now, for at least for most of 3 months or so. We do have some changes. We have some geolocated confirmation of the Russians taking some more of these high-rise buildings in the center part of the Chasov Yar. Russian sources say they took everything here, which, I mean, I could believe, but we don't have any flag raising, and they would definitely raise a lot of flags if they did actually take it. So I don't think they actually took it, but I do think they took some more positions here. But that being said, I do wonder why they have not taken the center of Chasov Yar yet. We do know that the Russians are in this area. They have taken this quarry up here, or at least most of it, and we have geolocated confirmation of the Russians now improving their position south here. So the Ukrainian positions here are completely abominable, completely very horrible. So I don't know why the Ukrainians are holding on for so long. Maybe they know that if their center Chasov Yar falls, that that's their main defensive positions, and the Ukrainians won't be able to hold on. In the trench map, we do have the Ukrainians setting up a bunch of trenches, to the, in front of Konstantinovka, just to prevent the Russians from pushing on. But, now they're going to be in the lowlands. Once the Russians take the center of Chasov Yar, they took the dominant height here. And then, everything, as they continue pushing down towards Konstantinovka, they're going to be going on the downhill. So, all the year-long offensive from Bakhmut to Chasov Yar has been a year-long struggle uphill. And then now the Russians will be able to go downhill. So it might be a bit easier. That's probably why the Ukrainians are trying to fight for Chasov Yar for so long. But yeah. We also have some geolocated confirmation of the Russians clearing out these trenches that are in this area right here between Grigorievka and this quarry. So, as I mentioned before, I do think the Russians will try to, reach this canal here, something like this, and, probably take the rest of this quarry right here as well. So, take something like this just to improve the northern positions of the Chasov Yar offensive. So we do have geolocated confirmation of the Russians taking more of this canal zone up in the north here. And then the Russian Ministry of Defense said they took Stupichki, but we don't have any geolocated confirmation of that. I do think Stupichki is more in the gray zone here. But, if they did take Stupichki and they actually are secure here, and they have positions right here, then, that's a good position for the Russians. I do think the Russians do have to move their position a bit more here. Probably try to take this high-rise building area here. If you, take this area and then, take, this area right here. And, because in order to actually, once they take the center chest here, I think they're going to announce the liberation of the village by raising their flags all over here. But to actually fully secure it, to actually have, besides the PR thing, they just have to take a bit more, just improve their positions in the south here a little bit, in that red line, and then obviously in that northern area here. So I do think, the battle for Chasov Yar is slowly, step by step, getting there. But it's very, the Russian commander maybe got worse or something happened. But the Ukrainians are putting up a very big fight here. And then in the Seversk direction, the Russians are making a lot of progress now. Before they were moving towards Grigorievka, now they're making a lot of progress in Verkhomanynska. We have geolocated confirmation of the Russians being on the most western end of this town. I don't, this town has been raised to the town, quote unquote, village. This village was raised to the ground, so there's nowhere to actually guard here. There's, if you look at this map, you might think, oh, the Russians are on this, on these buildings. They are not, because this entire area was blown to the ground. Maybe they could hide in a basement or some shit, but we shall see. That being said, the Russians are, improving the positions in the north of Verkhomanynska, taking this area, or at least pro-Russian sources are saying they're doing that. But, yeah, as I mentioned, in order to actually fully secure Verkhomanynska and Grigorievka, the Russians have to take the rest of this kind of hill, this area right here, which has the dominant height. If they could take the rest of this hill here, the Russians will be able to take Grigorievka, Verkhomanynska, and actually hold their positions, and then start battling for the village of Shirobrinka. And then once Shirobrinka falls, that will be the gateway to start encircling Seversk from the north here, and then start, putting the pressure on Seversk from multiple angles. But yeah, so the Russians have reached the very end of Verkhomanynska, and this is only possible because the Russians took the dominant height that was north of it. They did reach, before the Russian commander was changed here, they did, before the Russians took, these areas here, the Russians would kept trying to attack Verkhomanynska, but then get destroyed because they got they were on the low ground. The Ukrainians had the high ground. So Again, it's not sexy, but the Russians have to, it's like, clearing the Russians taking, taking something like this might not look like anything, but, again, it's not about looking good. It's about actually improving the tactical situation so you can actually improve their position here. So yeah, but the Russian push in this northern area, in these, actually capturing most of this like kind of dominant hill has allowed the Russians to actually start battling for Gorivka and Verkhomananska. And if they can take the rest of it, they can actually take these two villages and push the front closer to Seversk. Alrighty, now let us go to the Lyman direction. This is where a lot of interesting things are happening. This is where the Russians are improving their positions very interestingly. In the south here, there's been a lot of big changes. The first thing is that the battle for Kolodarsky is still ongoing. The Russians have captured about half this village. Specifically, these kind of like little like houses that are on the more eastern side, but this kind of center part of Kolodarsky, where most of the buildings are at, are still under Ukrainian control. It has a few high-rise building areas here too as well. So, but the Russians have to secure Kolodarsky to secure the southern flank of their bridge in here. I mentioned this before. It's like the taking Novi, secure their northern flank, and taking Kolodarsky will secure their southern flank. But we do have geolocated confirmation of the Russians actually being in Kolodarsky, but we don't have any confirmation that they have taken this village as of yet. But the rest of slowly but surely taking building by building in this village right here. Along with this, the Russians are now building for the village of Torskoye. The Russian Ministry of Defense said they liberated this entire village. I had my doubts about that. I think the Russian commanders here were just trying to jump the gun here. We do have geolocated confirmation of the Ukrainians like crossing this river here and trying to take over these like fish ponds right here. And so if the Ukrainians are still in control of these fish ponds, I do think the Russian positions in the center of Torskoye are not as secure as they once were. They have to remove the Ukrainians in these fish farms. So if the Ukrainians get pushed back to Zarishnya here, then I think what the Russians could do is link up with this Torskoye salient and then take the center of Torskoye, and then suddenly they have a more smoother front line here. But I do think the southern part of Torskoye is still under Ukrainian control. That being said, I do think the battle for Torskoye is now ongoing. The Russians are not battling for this village, but it is going to be the Ukrainians don't, now that the Russians are leaving behind kind of their, because now the Ukrainians can attack them from across the river as they're doing in the northern part here. So now, the Russians want to continue pushing south, which I think the main goal here is to link up with the Russians that are pushing to the north of Seversk and try to link up near Doronivka and Yampil, and then encircle the Ukrainians that are in the Sherebransky forest. But if they continue pushing southwards towards Yampil, they'll be attacked on their flanks here. So I do think if they take Kolodarsky, the Russians will then try to continue pushing towards the village of Stavka and try to reach the northern part of Zhorichnya, and then just to put the pressure on this area, just so the Russians have more breathing space to be able to make a bit more of a salient towards the Yampil. But yeah, that's where I think the things are going. So the battle for Torskoye is still ongoing, but I don't think the Russians have actually taken it like they said they did. But the battle for it, the Russians are in the village. And then more in the northern direction, the Russians are making some progress. The Russians are battling for the village of Retakup. We have geolocated confirmation the Russians taking at least the eastern part of this village, and the Russians are slowly but surely trying to take the rest of this village, step by step. Taking Retakup will allow the Russians to reach this kind of natural water reservoir right here, and allow them, reaching something like this. And then, the Russians could take, which is, this is what the Russians are trying to do. Then the Russians could then move along this reservoir, giving themselves a natural defense, and then, start crumbling the northern defenses of Lyman. The villages of Dorobzhitsky, Novoselivka, Shenodorovko. So, pushing southwards here, and the Retakup is the key to that, will start ungluing the northern defenses of Lyman, just like invading Yampil will unhinge the southern defenses of Lyman. And then the Russians are also continuously pushing in these fields in the Luhansk Oblast, just taking more and more of this area. We have geolocated confirmation of the Russians taking some more of these fields right here. So, they're slowly pushing from Makivka towards the village of Gerkovka here. I do think the Russians will try to take this village, and push, something like this. And I also think the Russians will try to link up with their bridgehead in this area right here. They're still, in this area here. So I do think the Russians will try to, link up this bridgehead here and take the rest of Luhansk Oblast here. Because from there, again, the main purpose here is this is not necessarily a tactical victory. It's just kind of more of a PR thing because they want to announce the complete liberation of Luhansk. So it's more of like a PR thing. So I think that's also why the Ukrainians are trying to hold on here. They actually have one of their more elite Azov battalions fighting in this direction to prevent the Russians from taking Nadivka, Novigorivka, and Tiveribilikovka here. So there's been a lot of back and forths here. Alrighty, now let us go to the Kupyansk direction, and there's been small changes here. The Ministry of Defense announced that they completely captured the village of Ratadivka here, but I do think this is the Russians jumping the gun again. I don't think the Russians would have been able to take this village if they didn't take already Kinerjovsky, and they didn't even announce they took it. We've had GLK confirmation of the Russians being, kind of outside this village, but not inside this village. Now, taking Kinerjovsky would be a very big gain for the Russians, because then this would be the main supply hub for the Russians trying to encircle Kupyansk from the north. But we don't have GLK confirmation of the Russians actually being inside this village yet, and so I think this push, the Russians taking Redivka was a premature call. I don't think the Russians are actually there, but we need some more GLK confirmation. Maybe it's not out of the question, obviously. Maybe there is a break in the defenses here, but it's definitely. We need more confirmation to see that. But if the Russians have to, what the Russians will probably try to do is take Kirendatsky, Radivka, and Globovka, and then from here, this will give them a very solid position to encircle, to start, encircling Kupyansk from the north. I do think they want to improve their positions here a little bit more. In my opinion, I do think the Russians will have to take the village of Malashepaki and Monochenivka here. So, I do think the Russians will have to take, just something like this, and just improve their positions a little bit. This will give them, very strong positions here to then push a bit more to the west, take the villages of Vilka, Shipaki, Somernovko, Pilamirivka, Semerberivko, and then from here, then this would allow them then have a very strong bridgehead to then cut off the western supply route of something like this. To actually cut off the western supply route from Kupyansk. So then they could push, to the south here and start putting this under FPV drone control, and then, very much strangle the defenses of Kupyansk here. But yeah, besides that, there's been no other changes in the Kupyansk direction. In the Kharkov direction, there's been no changes. The only big thing is it seems like the Russians are step by step, slowly but surely, taking the rest of the northern part of Volchansk. As you can see, the Seversk Donetsk River splits Volchansk in half, and I have no clue why the Russians weren't able to take at least the northern part of the village just yet. We haven't seen the Russians completely take this yet, but I do think that I don't think the Russians will be able to take the rest of Volchansk, because then they'll have to cross the river, and this will lead to supply issues. But that being said, I do think the Russians will have a will be able to take the rest of this. The northern part of Volchansk, because they're taking it step by step. It seems like they have now taken most of the high-rise buildings, but it will take so I do think the Russians will try to take the northern part of Volchansk, but besides that, I don't think the Russians will take the southern part. But it seems like the Russians are slowly, step by step, about to take it. And then finally, in the Kursk Sumy direction, the Russians are making some small progress. We have GLK confirmation the Russians are completely liberating the village of Lakovka here. I do think, and this village kind of bleeds into the main Ukrainian supply hub of Yunatovka here. So this is where the Ukrainians are trying to hold off. And I do think this is one of the main Russian objectives for creating the buffer zone here. That being said, in order to do that, the Russians will have to, I always thought the Russians would try to take, a bunch of these villages to try to cut off Yunatovka from the west here, because I do think they need to physically cut this road to take Yunatovka. And also, they need to start battling for a Statki here, because, as the Russians push into Yunatovka, the Ukrainians could continuously, have multiple positions to supply this, to support this town. And, the Russians will have to, yes, they take Lakovna here, and they've entered the northern part of this, of this town. But if they want to continue pushing into it, I do think they need to put more pressure on it. I do think the Russians will have to, move through these fields, try to take these, try to take these forests right here, and then also push down from here, and have something like this under their control as well. So then from here, then they'll have Yunatovka encircled in 3 directions, and then they'll be able to take it. And then in the bigger picture here, the Russians will then be able to have a very small, but not very small, but a pretty decent sized buffer zone that will prevent the Ukrainians from entering back to where they came from in Suchka. That being said, I do think once this happens, the Russians will then improve, start trying to push here. We talked about how the Russians pushed the Ukrainians out of this area right here in Belgorod, and I do think, if the Russians are smart, I think the Russians would try to, start making a bridgehead here. And, if we look at the bigger picture here, there's a river here. And I do think the Russians will then, try to, reach the village of Mordiska here, and then, use the river as a defense line here. And then from here, so let me kind of like look at the big picture here. So the Russians will, clear something like this, and then clear something like that. And then if we look at this kind of more eastern direction of Sumy, there's a, the Russians could then put, kind of link up in this area right here, because, they could push from their positions in this area, try to take these border villages, and then push towards the village of Malorubinski here, and then once they reach here, then they continue pushing westwards with the main goal of reaching the villages of Gurinovki and Senia, and then this could link up with their positions here, and then they could then, reach the village of Olzovsky, and then the southern tip would reach the village of Uradudivka. This sounds like some Hungarian name or some shit. But then something like this. So then if we look at the big picture of what I think the Russians will try to do with their bridge, their Sumy bridgehead, it will be something like this. There's a river in the south here as well, so I think this will protect the Ukrainians here. But I think this will allow the Russians to then, have a very solid bridgehead. They could use Mirapilia as like a supply base, and then from here I do think then the Russians will try to activate on this area and try to reach the village of Bilopilia and try to cut off this highway that supplies Sumy with the main. There's another river that goes something like this, I believe, and so the Russians could use this river as a natural defense as they push south, and then try to take something like this going on. So I do think then, or let me rewrite this. Hold up. Yeah, something like this, I think, is what the Russians will be trying to accomplish. Something like this. I think this would create a very solid Sumy buffer zone for Russia, and from this would also give them the preconditions to start operations to take Sumy, if they so choose. And then everything else in the Sumy Oblast, nothing much. The Ukrainians are still trying to enter the village of Tekhino here. Some sources are saying they have some positions in kind of these border checkpoints here, but they have not actually been able to take most of this village. But I do think this is just a pinning operation to try to prevent the Russians from, to draw Russian reinforcements here. And besides that, that's it for the front line. Besides that, there's only been changes in the Russian talks between the direct peace talks in Turkey have led to nothing really. The Russians actually held on to their demands, which are unacceptable to the Ukrainians. The only thing they agreed on was a prisoner exchange, which happened. The Ukrainians are doing massive drone strikes on Russia, and the Russians are repeating with missile strikes. It's kind of funny how the Russians, they don't actually strike these military targets until the Ukrainians strike them, which is kind of odd. It's like, if there's they're like, we destroyed this drone factory in Kiev because, and that's what you get for attacking us. It's like, so basically they knew this drone factory existed. They had the resources to take it out, but they decided not to because they didn't want to for some reason. It's like, why, why would you, you could attack this regardless if they attack you or not. This is a war, right? So anyway, it's kind of funny how they avoid attacking military targets in Ukraine unless, Russia gets attacked, which is kind of funny, kind of cuckish. But anyway, it seems like the war will go on at least for the rest of this year, and we shall see how the Russians develop their summer offensive. So that's the end of this video. If you want to continue receiving these weekly Russian career updates, be sure to subscribe to my channel, give the video a thumbs up, share this video around, comment your thoughts, and I hope you have a wonderful day. So aim high and wander on.